Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Atman Deshpande, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I extend a warm welcome to all to today's special lecture titled The Trump Xi Jinping Summit, a Grand Bargain or More of the Same. Due to unavoidable circumstances, Professor Alka Acharya, Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, will not be able to join us today. She has expressed her regrets. The lecture explores the strategic significance of the summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping amid growing global tensions. It argues that the United States seeks a broader understanding with China in order to ease pressure from simultaneous challenges involving Russia and the Middle East. However, despite the possibility of cooperation, deep disagreements remain between Washington and Beijing over global power, Taiwan, military strategy, and technological competitions. This discussion will therefore examine America's objective in engaging China, the extent to which China may accommodate them, and the wider implications such an arrangement could have for the international order and other countries. The speaker for today's lecture is Dr. Amit Gupta. Dr. Amit Gupta is a senior fellow with the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, USA. Prior to this, he was a member of the faculty at the Department of International Security at the U.S. Air Force Air War College, Maxwell, AFB. He specializes in international security affairs, the arms trade, and U.S. national security policy. Dr. Amit has co-authored, or edited several books, including Building an Arsenal, The Evolution of Regional Power Force Structures, published by Prager, India's Nuclear Security, published by Line Reiner, The Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific, Maritime Challenges, Opportunities, and Policies, published by Rutledge, and Air Force's Next Generation, published by Ashgate. He has published in Asian Survey, Security Dialogue, The National Interest, Comparative Strategy, and Prism. In the realm of popular culture, he has written in academic journals and magazines on science fiction and politics, the political economy of James Bond, international cricket, and the globalization of sports. The chair for today's lecture is Dr. Atul Bharadwaj. He is an academic and strategic affairs analyst, currently affiliated with the School of Policy and Global Affairs at City, University of London. His research examines the intersection of geopolitics, maritime strategy, and shifting connectivity paradigms. He is the author of India-America Relations, 1942 to 62, rooted in the liberal international order, published by Rutledge in 2019. He has been a regular contributor to the strategic affairs column of the Economic and Political Weekly since 2013. Before I hand over to the chair, I will ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping guidelines. All participants will be muted during the lecture. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Bharadwaj.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Professor Amit. And it's a rare privilege and, of course, an honor for ICS to have this special lecture where we're going to discuss one of the most complex relationships of our times, that is the US-China relations. We're all very familiar with the topic. One, because we are looking at China very closely at ICS. The other factor is that US President Trump recently visited China and he's been in news all over. And therefore, this particular talk is of special interest to us to understand what's happening when the US has, for the first time, accepted China as a near peer competitor. And and it's so in that respect, we look forward to Professor Amit's talk today and explaining the dynamics of this relationship and the trajectory it is likely to follow in the coming decades. Over to you, Amit. We look forward to an enchanting talk.
Well, thank you, Atul, and thank you to the Institute of Chinese Studies for making this possible. I want to start by saying one thing. I've had a very long association with the Institute, and one of the reasons I'm so fond of it is it proves that if academics are interested in something, are willing to carry out a labor of love, then they can essentially overcome some very difficult problems in trying to maintain the institute. And just to put this in perspective, I've visited the institute in civil lines, two different locations, near the Supreme Court, and now finally in Chittaranjan Park. So it's moved around far more than any other institution has in New Delhi. It has not got the governmental support that any other institution, again in New Delhi, has got. But this has been starting with academics like Meera Sena, Giri Deshinkar, Manoranjan Mohanty, all the way up to Alka and Srimati now, pushing to keep this vision of an Indian scholarship on China going. And that is truly impressive. And it just proves that even today in India, there's a lot of hope for academia because institutions like this exist. All right. It's about 6:36 my time, which means it's 5:06 your time. I'll go for half an hour, Atul, if that's okay. And then that'll leave enough time for
That's
people to talk.
perfectly fine. The question answer session, I'm sure, would be more interesting, obviously, as
That's
also.
what I think too. Yeah. So look, let me start by explaining the framework of this talk. First, I think it's important to understand what the assumptions of American foreign policy are. And contrary to what people may think, they don't change much from administration to administration. Secondly, how did the Trump administration approach this summit? What was the response they got from the Chinese? What is it going to be like when the next summit happens in fall? And what can we talk about the future? So, about five things to talk about here. Now, let me start with what is the fundamental assumption of American foreign policy. And that is very simply since the times of Bill Clinton, we will not give up on unipolarity. So, whatever any American president may say, at the end of the day, it is about maintaining unipolarity. And if you look at it, Obama talked about G2, went back to saying China is a near peer competitor. Trump has mentioned G2, but he really doesn't mean it. And there's a lot of writing out there now which suggests that, well, Trump is talking multipolarity. No, he isn't. Every action that Trump takes is very much that of a unipolar nation, and that should be accepted. At best, the thinking in Washington has been to not have a G2, but maybe have a G1.5. But China is the half serious partner in this. Now, the second part in American foreign policy was said by Kishore Mehbubani, who pointed out that America has three strategic challenges: the Middle East, Russia, and China. But in real terms, it can only do one out of three. So it has to compromise, negotiate some kind of settlement with two to pursue the third. And if you go back to George Bush Jr., George Walker Bush, he said when he became the president, China is our strategic competitor. Then 9/11 happens, and he spends the next 8 years in the Middle East. Obama talks about a G2, a pivot to Asia, goes back to the Middle East. Arab Spring happens, other things happen. Trump gets 4 good years where the Middle East is not an issue. And therefore, he centers his attention on China. And when he does that, he talks tariffs, he talks denial of technology. They do things like restricting Chinese students coming into the country, so on. Biden gets 2 years where he can talk China. Then Ukraine happens, then Gaza happens. And now the United States is back in the Middle East again. So the problem for the US going into the summit was very clear. You can only do one out of three strategic challenges, but as of 2026, you are doing 3 out of 3 strategic challenges. You're trying to resolve Ukraine and Russia. You still don't have a blueprint for what to do in the Middle East, be it Gaza, be it Iran. And then you have China. This was part one of the puzzle. The second part was that, and this is the criticism that's come out of most scholars in America, that the Trump administration did not do enough preparation for this summit. The idea was more to go like what's called, fly by the seat of your pants, to do this in an ad hoc way. So there was no serious preparatory work. There were no meetings between deputies on both sides. And what you end up with is, therefore, a summit where the Americans come in with a few transactional ideas, but no big vision of what kind of strategic framework you want with the Chinese. Okay? And that then becomes where the Americans are coming from. What is happening on the Chinese side? The Chinese come well prepared for this. And one thing I should point out, the Chinese kept Trump waiting for 18 months because they wanted a serious negotiation. They wanted a permanent negotiation. They wanted something like the Shanghai communiques between Mao and Nixon, which lasted for 35, 40 years. Now, they didn't get anything like that. But what did the Chinese essentially say? What I thought was interesting was, first, Xi Jinping talks about the Thucydides trap. That was very good because it brought up a way of looking at international relations that is not thought of so much in Washington in this administration, or indeed even in the Biden administration. That what are the consequences of a clash between the United States and China? And the thing with the Thucydides trap part is, which is very important, is it's based on two conventional nations going to war. It's not based on two nuclear nations going to war. More importantly, it's not based on two economically interdependent nations going to war. This is a very different ballgame than what Graham Allison was talking about in his book. And it's one where, unless the United States and China handle this very carefully and imaginatively, both sides can end up getting hurt because the capacity to hurt on both sides is quite strong. So the fact that Xi Jinping brought this up was very important. The second part of what Xi Jinping brought up, which I thought made complete sense, was let us make this a strategic relationship which is based on stability. And what he meant by stability was, he said, a stability where we cooperate, a stability where we have manageable differences, a stability where we have competition, but it is within the proper limits. And then we have a stability which leads to expected peace. He was actually talking about a kind of G2, which has a multilateral element to it, which can lead to not just global development, but which is a win-win for both countries. Now, on the American side, what came out of this was there was little thinking on where do we go in terms of a world order. What was done was let's do transactions, which the Trump administration is very good at. So let's talk trade, let's talk technology, let's talk artificial intelligence. And it then boiled down to things like buy more soybeans, buy Boeings, buy beef. These are actually very minor things if you look at it in the overall scheme. The more interesting ones are technology, AI, and I would point out where the two countries stand in their relationship to each other. On technology, here is the deal. The Americans are now beginning to admit that they're fighting a losing battle on this one. Eric Schmidt of Google said now the Chinese are about 6 months behind on AI. And if 6 months means nothing in a technology race, it's actually very little. You are going to see a China which is advancing quite rapidly on technologies. You are seeing a China which already is at 30% of its energy coming from renewables. You are seeing a China which in the 15th five-year plan is going to heavily integrate AI into restructuring society. And this is going to lead to a more formidable challenger. And Trump understood this. the China that Trump visited 9 years ago is not the China that he saw in 2026. So the technology aspect is the US is still the world leader. The US is doing incredibly well in certain areas. The Chinese are not just catching up, they are using technology to truly redevelop their economy, something which is not happening at the same pace in the United States. And I think this is a very important thing to keep in mind. On the AI issue, what's important to remember about it is that this is a low-hanging fruit. AI is not the big deal in that sense. And let me explain what I mean by that. Both the United States and China understand very well that AI can be a major problem if it is not controlled. And some of the things that people are talking about have been discussed even in the Biden administration. Like, for example, to what extent do you allow AI to be used in modern warfare? And one of the things that some scholars are talking about in the United States now is how about we have a global treaty where all nuclear nations agree that they will not use AI for the command and control of their nuclear weaponry? And this could be a very profound treaty if it comes through, by the way. The other one that they're talking about is given that so much of AI is open source, what do you do if a rogue actor decides to use open source AI to do a major hack or do something even more nefarious? And for that, American Chinese cooperation makes a lot of sense. So I think this is one area where, regardless of what happens otherwise, things are going to move ahead. Now, where do we go from here? If you look at the news reports and all this, there's been a lot of talk that not much came out of this summit. That's actually not true. They met after a long time and after a few years of pretty bad relations. They're talking about meeting in fall. It's not clear when, September or October. But I would say this, don't write off the summit, because what came out of this summit was, after a long time, both parties talked to each other intensely. Trump took along his big technology players, people like Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, Tim Cook of Apple, and of course, Elon Musk. And what I expect is that it's the second summit where you will actually see things happening. That is where the real movement in the relationship will come, certainly on trade and technology. Now, the thing is, both sides need the trade. And I don't need to talk about rare earth and so on, but America depends on cheap Chinese products. Chinese depend on exports to America, but much less than they did 10 years ago, because now China's biggest trading partners are ASEAN and the EU. But the other thing that they are talking about, which from the Chinese perspective is very interesting, is the Chinese want to go the Japanese route and the uh, pathway taken by the Germans, which is start investing in the United States. They would like to set up Chinese factories in the US, and this will be one part of what will be pushed in the summit. On the technology side, the Chinese, yes, would like more access. They've been given the second tier NVIDIA chip, but they are going to be asking for more concessions from the US there. Now, what I think is, let me put it this way. What I think the real issue is that the United States has to decide how to react to the strategic plan that Xi Jinping has put out there. And the way to react to this plan is not just talking about trade and investments, but it is to talk about what kind of alternative world order you can conceive of. And I would say this, I don't think Xi Jinping is going to show up in Washington if substantive moves are not taken on the fundamentals like trade and investment. But also you start seeing the Americans talking about confidence building, what to do on Taiwan, so on. And all this will be discussed quite heavily, I would say, in Washington, D.C. in the next few months. Now, there are a lot of people who think the Trump administration may not be able to do this. I'm a bit more optimistic only for one reason, that the big technology players realize that they need China. And because the big technology players realize that they need China, they are going to come up with a plan and make that part of the American strategy. So, what do I think is the long term in this? Two parts. I think come September, October, the Trump administration will come out with agreements which the Chinese would be willing to discuss. I think the Trump people will also have to lower the rhetoric on Taiwan. Now, again, it's not clear whether the second tranche of arms will go through or whether it'll go through in a reduced form. My own sense is he may do it in a reduced form so that he can maintain uh, a certain level of American leverage in this. I think that part of it is there. And I'm not sure, this is something which I'd like to hear what you guys have to say, is how the Americans will react, sorry, how the Chinese will react to a reduced tranche of weaponry going from America. By the way, I should point out one thing. Given the way weapons have been expended in Ukraine and in the Middle East, nothing is going to be available to Taiwan till the 2030s. So we're talking 5 years down the line, despite whatever anybody may be saying. Because right now, all the orders in American factories are booked up till the next 5 years or so. So I think this part of it is there. The other part, which I think is interesting, is can you concede on unipolarity? And the answer to that simply is no. I don't think the Trump people can do it. It would be a huge leap of imagination there. But I think it's inevitable. So, two precedents down from Trump, you'll start seeing people talking more seriously about the G2. And that is where I believe the real interesting conversations will happen. What is the danger in between? Does Taiwan blow up? Does, for some other reason, the United States and China decide that they have irreconcilable differences? And therefore, what I think would be most important is to make dead sure that that hotline between the two countries is kept open. And the American complaint on this, by the way, is that the Chinese don't pick up on occasion. So something will have to be done in that area. So I think that part is there, which really brings me to, well, what about the rest of the world? And let me put it this way. Two parts to this puzzle. First part is there's a lot of thinking around the world that what we want is the Americans and the Chinese do not come to blows, but at the same time, the Americans and the Chinese don't get too friendly. Because we've all heard the old expression, when the elephants make love, the grass suffers. So, what happens to middle powers around the world, smaller nations around the world, if you go back to a G2 of the Cold War days, to put it simply? And my own sense on this is middle powers can make themselves very relevant in today's world order. And I'll give you an example of this from an Indian perspective, since I'm talking largely to an Indian audience. Think about it this way. India is one of the few countries which has a diplomatic relationship with the Palestinians and the Israelis. But India did not come forward and say, we will broker Israeli-Hamas peace talks. I think that was a lost opportunity. Again, India is one of the few countries which can say it has a decent relationship with Israel, the United States, and Iran. Why not be the person or be the nation that is hosting this conversation? So, by and large, I think there is a lot of space as the two great powers start discussing things amongst each other for other nations to maneuver. but the question is how to get there. Now, I'll end by saying this. I think this battle is not going to be fought in the South China Sea or East China Sea, because both sides realize how devastating that can be. This will be a battle which will be fought between Google and Huawei. Both will, or Google and Alibaba, choose which companies you want. And they are the ones that are going to decide it. The other people who are going to fight this battle are the Federal Reserve of the United States and the Central Bank of China. So put all this together, where do I see this going? I think the October summit will be very interesting to look at, because in the October summit, what we see is the two parties coming better prepared. The Chinese were well prepared for this one. They'll be equally well prepared for the next one. But I think the Americans will be better prepared. They will come up and address some of the issues that Xi Jinping brought up, which is how do you manage differences? How do you have competition within limits? This kind of thing, the thinking is starting in Washington as of now. So I think that is very important. I also feel that the big issue will be allowing Chinese investment in. And look at this from an American perspective. The whole idea with MAGA is to bring back manufacturing in America. The whole idea of MAGA is to revive those areas of the American economy, spatially, that have become depressed. The only big investor that can do this is China. But then the question is, on what terms and conditions do you bring the Chinese in? So this summit should be seen as the precursor to a bigger relationship. This summit was not disappointing because both sides essentially pointed out what their positions were. And the summit also was important for a third reason. That is that both sides also realized that they have to build on what they've started. You can't continue this kind of aggressive pathway of tariffs and technology restraints, so on. I'll leave it at that. Let's have a discussion and see where we go.
Thank you so much, Amit, for a fascinating talk. And you've explained it wonderfully that the US wants to maintain unipolarity, and in no way, whether Trump or no Trump, it's not going to concede on unipolarity. The question, of course, which many would ask is, would it be possible for US to maintain unipolarity? That's the big challenge, and that's the big question, basically. The other thing that you said about, which I really liked, was that US does not want to have G2 kind of an arrangement with China. However, it may be satisfied with G1.5 kind of an arrangement, where it maintains its primacy in global affairs, and China plays a second fiddle to the United States primarily. Will China agree to that? Will China agree to G2 or G1.5 is another question which comes up. And the issue is that we'll wait for the October summit, and much would become clearer during the October summit. America needs investment. China is willing to invest, but it's at its own terms in America. Now, how that would play out, within the rest of within the middle powers, how they are going to view this, if the Chinese are going to invest heavily there, that's another. Will they also start seeking Chinese investments? There are some reservations in India on seeking Chinese investment, for that matter. So if US gives a green signal that Chinese investments are acceptable, how the middle powers, which are friendly and allies of the United States, how are they going to react, and how is that going to play out in the long term? That's another question which would come up. But I'll stop here, and I'll let the question answer session go on. I'm sure there are going to be more interesting questions, and I'll also keep butting in with my questions in between. So it's over to the. Are there any questions? They'll come up subsequently, I'm sure.
They'll come up. I think people are thinking. Yeah.
No, but the issue is that, if US can maintain unipolarity, that's one of the big questions is because, see the way the Chinese are advancing in terms of technology. Earlier there was no one who could compete with the US on in terms of technology. Even Soviet Union, for that matter, was not really a peer competitor with the United States. On the other aspect, you see the Navy. Navy is another aspect which America boasts, which the American power boasts. That again, the Chinese are challenging in a massive manner in the maritime domain. Currency is another thing which the Chinese are moving in aggressively towards destabilizing the power of the dollar. So, if one looks at all these aspects, in military terms, of course, they've established a good kind of a deterrence primarily, not just nuclear deterrence, but even conventional deterrence within the South China Sea, within the. So, in that respect, how difficult or how will be is for United States to maintain unipolarity and its primacy in the international affairs.
Sure. Atul, I think we have two questions. There's Mahua Chakravarti is asking, could China's transition towards renewable energy and technological self-reliance reduce its vulnerability to US economic pressure in the future? Which I think is an important question to answer. And yes, Mahua, absolutely. Because look, what the Chinese have done is, which is impressive, over 30% of the power generated in China now comes from renewable energy. And they are already up to 1,200 gigawatts of power 6 years in advance of what their plans were. So they're going to keep building in this area. Now, as they go more towards renewable energy, they are also going to encourage everybody else to move in that direction. And after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and everything else that is going on in the Middle East, everybody in Asia, which is an energy dependent continent, is going to look for this kind of alternative source. So I think it's not just that the Chinese are reducing their dependence rapidly, but they will make or they will help other people reduce their dependence on oil rapidly. Now, there is a strategic ramification for this, and that is as the dependence on oil goes down, the dependence on petrodollars also goes down. And that hits the economic structure that the US has created globally. So, at both levels, it's very important from a Chinese perspective, but also global perspective. I mean, look at countries like Philippines, Indonesia, and so on, how rapidly they've taken up electrical vehicles. And those are all Chinese, by the way. And this is the future. So, what a lot of people are now saying is oil will be important, but it's not going to be the driving force of the global economy as it was, let's say, 20 years ago. And in that sense, you have to say that the Chinese push towards alternative energies did this. The other thing you have to see in the Chinese system, which I think is really important, is their dependence on the United States and the West keeps going down because they keep investing in technologies across the board and they keep succeeding. Atul, you talked about the military dimension. The Chinese have done really well with missiles. The Chinese have done extremely well with missiles. The Chinese are now doing well with aircraft. The Chinese are doing well with their ships. In every sector of the defense economy, they are making technological leaps and bounds. And the thing to remember is that drones have reshaped warfare. 70% of all drone components, still very recently, were made in China. So China is far from being dependent on the US. And as it moves away from oil, it'll be even less dependent. Let me put it this way. Sandeep Kumar Mishra has his hand up.
Yes, Sandeep. Yes, Sandeep, you can ask
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Thank
Oh,
you,
hi.
Dr. Gupta.
Yeah.
Yeah, good to
Mm.
see you, and always wonderful to listen to you. I was really impressed by how coherently you put actually this summit and outcomes. I have a question related to a few other things which are also, in my opinion, important, especially Trump 2.0. After coming to power, I realized that the friends and allies of United States, they are much more uncomfortable than China is. So what happens that I study about Korea, I also study about Japan, I can say even about India. I think we realize that I think the American coordination with all of us, friends and allies together, in dealing with China or say deciding future or say existing global order, it has gone to almost negligible, you can say. So my point is that it seems to me that whereas China and suppose China, Russia, they're having more communication, North Korea, they're having more communication, maybe Iran and Pakistan also, maybe Belarus could also be. So whereas the other so-called disruptor, they are getting connected and they are probably having some kind of blueprint for future. I don't think Americans are having any blueprint for future, including coordinating with friends and allies in different parts of the world. So how come you basically look at how do you look at Americans giving up all these allies and friends, and how what like say going alone with China? So what would be your comment and observation about
Right.
this part?
Well, you've raised two important issues, Sandeep.
Mm.
One is the allies' discomfort with the Trump administration. But the other is that, as happens in any situation like this, other countries start to band together. So let me take the second part first, and then I'll get back to the allies. Look, what is coming in the world now is CRINC. CRINC is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Okay, and as I've been saying recently, even in the BRICS, I think in the BRICS, the I is not going to be India, the I is going to be Iran, because the convergence of interests between Russia, Iran, and China are much stronger than the convergence of interests between India, Russia, and China, even though they could be. You know, CRINC is more important than BRICS because CRINC is largely a military alliance, even though it's not said that way. And the Americans call it the axis of upheaval. And that's mainly because there's too many people in America who watch the History Channel and are obsessed with World War II. So everything has to be an axis. You remember George Bush also talked about axis of evil and brought the Iranians, the Iraqis, and the North Koreans into it. And the North Koreans couldn't figure out why they got put on that list. But the point that I'm making is look at how these countries are now militarily working together. The North Koreans went and fought extremely well for the Russians. Okay? And you know this better than I do. The Chinese have given targeting information to the Iranians, which is why the Iranian strikes in the Gulf have been, and in Israel, have been quite devastating. And the Russians have been sending arms to the Iranians. This is only going to grow. The Iranians gave the uh, production rights to the Russians to make the Shahid drone, which then becomes the geranium. You are seeing a counter military balance, which is not NATO and Warsaw Pact. This is now a global alliance, and we don't know who else will come into it, and it's only going to grow. I think this part of it is there because it'll be interesting to see what Iran's strategic choices are after this war is over. They may go nuclear, who knows? But one thing is for sure, they are going to build up more of their military capability with the help of the Russians and the Chinese. And neither is going to be stopped from doing that. I think that part is there. So you are seeing a really solid connection now coming about in the world militarily to counter America's military dominance. On the Allies part, look, I think, again, if you were to look at this is a bit more complicated than it's put in the press. In the press, it's always NATO is in threat, the allies are crying, so on. Well, here's what. Let us look at the allies. And there's two categories of allies here, the Asian allies and the European allies. The European allies base their global understanding on two things. And let's be frank about this, because if you bring in some European to talk, they'll have trouble explaining this to you. One is they have a civilizational identity with the United States. We are white, you are white. And remember when Marco Rubio went to NATO and he went on about my ancestors came from Spain, and I was laughing my head off because I've been to Cuba. Cuba doesn't look like Marco Rubio. Cuba is Afro-Caribbean, you know. But okay, so the whole of the Cuban people are Spanish. Somebody else said, well, it's Christianity that he was talking about. No, he was talking about white Christianity. He wasn't talking about Christianity. So the Europeans are still caught up in this idea of a civilizational identity. And look at it. Where have they been critical of the Trump administration? Except for Greenland, because Greenland really hit home. Okay. And the Danes took that very seriously. But what the point is, they have nowhere to go. They can't go and talk to the Chinese. They lack the imagination. They can't, after having done all this to the Russians are going to demand their pound of flesh if the Europeans come knocking at that door. They're stuck with the United States, number one. Number two, what Trump is saying is pay your fair share. And that is not a bad thing to say. And I'll tell you why. Every American president since Eisenhower has told the Europeans, pay your fair share. And what have the Europeans said? Yes, we will do it. And then they never do. So Trump said, okay, I'm not going to help you. And he scared the living daylights out of them. And let me point out how bad things have become. I mean, I can show the slide if you like. Let me see if, this will probably do it well. Here we go. Yeah. I've got that, not this one. That one is the MAGA slide, but I'll just bring this up for you. And I think this, no, not this one either. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Okay. Can you all see it? Yeah. These are the major militaries of the West. And it's very interesting. I'll only take the British because the British still think they have an empire, and that empire has a headquarters in New Delhi. But okay, I understand that. I laugh uproariously at it, and I'll tell you why. Britain at the height of the Cold War had 180,000 soldiers. Today it has 80,000 soldiers. So to put this in perspective, you could put the entire English army in Wembley Stadium, which has a seating capacity of 90,000, and you would still have 10,000 seats left for Millwall supporters. Millwall is my favorite hooligan team in England, whose motto is, nobody likes us, we don't care. Okay? And they sing it also, by the way. The general consensus in Washington is if the British are lucky, they may be able to put a brigade out to go to war somewhere. Okay. Now, the Germans, look at it, they went from an army of 327,000 to 62,000. Again, put them in Wembley Stadium. Now you can put 30,000 Millwall supporters in. Now, the Germans talk without thinking about this. Oh, we will have conscription. You're an old population. In Ukraine, they've done conscription. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is 43. Okay? This is reality. If the Germans did it, their average age would probably be 50. These people can't fight. These people are talking about pumping money in. The Germans have put 100 billion euro in. But do you know what they've done? They had about 300 tanks. Only 95 were working. The other 200 were mothballed. A lot of that 100 billion went to revitalize these tanks. The other thing they did, which was equally important, was They're now building 100 Leopard tanks at 32 million euro a piece, to which the whole world is laughing and saying, is Mercedes making these tanks? So the thing is, the Europeans do not have anywhere to go. And remilitarization for them would be very difficult. Trump understands this. Now, to come to Japan, China, South Korea, and so on, the same thing applies there, that Trump would like to see the Japanese be more militarized. And in the days of his old friend Abe, that was certainly going to be there. This new prime minister, who knows where she's headed with this, because he sees that as helping with the American project. Okay. It's the same thing with the South Koreans, build up. And I think the South Koreans will for different reasons now, because all those THAAD missiles and Patriots have been pulled out of South Korea. South Korean engineering will look to replace all this, which is good for South Korea. You see what I'm saying? Okay. My own sense on this, Sandeep, is that at the end of the day, the Western alliance cannot break with the United States and be more equidistant and go with the Chinese beyond trade. Okay, we'll buy some electric vehicles. I think the big thing that will happen is BYD will be allowed into Europe. Okay. BYD will be allowed into Europe. That is what will happen. BYD is coming to Canada. That's about as far as it'll go. But an equidistant Europe playing a sort of a role as a multipolar element in the world, no, that's not going to happen. And I'm not sure. I mean, you know the demographics of Japan and South Korea and North Korea better than I do, and Taiwan. These are all very elderly nations. And what is the fertility rate in South Korea now?
It's 0.92. 0.92.
0.92.
Actually,
Okay.
at one point of time, it reached actually 0.74, but it had been restored a bit in last few
Yeah.
months.
Yeah.
Less than one, actually. Yeah.
Okay. So, the point is they are way beyond they're way below the replacement level. What are they going to fight with 10 years from now? And Ukraine is the same way, Europe is the same way. So none of these people, and forget the Japanese. I mean, last time I was in Tokyo, I was looking desperately for couples who had 2 children. And I found one in a very expensive hotel in Tokyo, which, by the way, I was not staying in, lest anybody thinks otherwise. They don't have children. So if you don't have kids, who's going to go and fight? So, I mean, the real problem, and Trump knows this, Trump is not stupid. Trump knows that these people don't have options. So if you don't have options, pay. So I think that is the way you have to look at it. But can the Europeans become equidistant? No. Can the Japanese become equidistant? No. So in real terms, this thinking that Trump has been germinating for about 30, 40 years in Washington. He actually decided to implement it. I think that's how you have to look at that. Sorry, a very long answer to what you said, but what you said I found very interesting.
No, but Amit, a corollary to this basically is that, now having seen in the Middle East, the current war with Iran in the Middle East, and the kind of destruction of the Middle East, the disruption of the region itself, militarily, they've been hit. There's a
Right.
disruption of trade. So, looking at this and the kind of, the extent to which you can, the shock and awe probably, if you see in this particular war, has come from Iran rather than coming from United States.
Yes.
Based on the kind of asymmetric warfare that they've developed. So looking at all this, the Japanese, they may remain closer to United States. Taiwan may remain closer to United States, but will they be willing to go to war to disrupt their region, basically, on behalf of the United States, for that matter, or if China doesn't provoke them in that manner? So will this particular region, like Ukraine, it is said that one of the reasons for Ukraine going to getting into war is the NATO's expansion also. plans for expansion, I would say. Similarly, why would a region go to a war? Why would a region, because having seen massive disruptions which such a war causes?
It's well, two-part answer to this. I was listening to one Chinese scholar who put it really well. He said, look, Taiwan is not a problem. Okay. We understand Taiwan, we know what to do. And the one thing which is very important, which everybody in India and elsewhere watching this should realize is the Chinese are never scared of fighting a superior opponent. And they've said this very clearly. This idea that, yes, the US military is superior, everybody agrees for now. But the Chinese point out, we go to war with them over Taiwan, we lose. But can the US sustain being there for 60, 70 years? And we both know the answer is no. Then what? And we will continue the fight. So they are willing to go to war. That's the first part of this. The second part, which they are really worried about, is Japanese rearmament. Because Japanese rearmament, if it's coupled with nuclearization, and you and I grew up with this idea, the Japanese are pacifist. There is a lot of thinking changing in the hard right in Japan on should we have nuclear weapons or not. Yeah? And I think that will change things in Northeast Asia. Now, yeah, I agree. Logically, neither the Japanese nor the South Koreans would want a war because it would be devastating. But unfortunately, is that going to be what drives future or prevents future militarization? And I think the answer is no. But I'll come back to what you said on unipolarity, which is really interesting. I think there's two parts to this. One is America's expenditure now is enormous. The defense budget is going to go to 1.25 trillion. But add to that the 400 billion, which is spent on pensions and medical care. So now you're already up to 1.65 trillion. So it always brings up the question, when does the defense budget bankrupt the American economy? That's problem one. Problem two in this is the debt keeps spiraling. And if you look at, what is happening with the debt of the United States, let me bring this up again. I'll just do a share on it. And then, this is going to be an interesting one to look at. Let me see. Yeah, there we go. Look, in 2018, these were the people who held the major treasury bills of America. China was number one with 1.1 trillion, then came Brazil, Japan, then came Brazil, etc., etc. Now, look what happens by 2025. Japan is the biggest holder with 1.1 trillion. The British are almost at 900 billion. China has come down to 730 billion. And the Chinese are slowly but steadily reducing this commitment to the US. Now, this 20 years or 25 years of war that the US has fought since 9/11 has been funded in part by all this external borrowing. If external borrowing doesn't happen, what are you going to do? Now, the other thing which is not understood in Washington is just how diversified China has become. These are China's top trading partners today. I'll let everybody take a look at the screen and see what has happened. RCEP has become a roaring success. ASEAN and China, it's 982 billion. European Union is 785. US is third. And look at where they're doing. Even Australia, which is a population which is smaller than the national capital region of Delhi, has a trade of $211 billion with the Chinese. The Chinese are well diversified here now. And sorry.
No, I agree with you.
And I'll add one more thing to this. This is the penetration in Europe. This is foreign direct investment in Europe by the Chinese. Now, if you look at that, the only countries that are not included on this map are sort of Norway and Iceland, because Norway is not part of the European Union, though it is part of the Schengen. But you look at where the Chinese have invested, 84 billion in Britain, 23 billion in France, 34 billion in Germany, 15 billion in Italy. They are not investing in Eastern Europe. It's very small amounts in Eastern Europe. They are seriously investing in the big three in Europe, which is Germany, France, and Britain. So the Chinese strategy is one which is at multiple levels. And will the United States be able to compete on that? No. And I'll add one more thing on unipolarity, which is, I think, really important. And that is the American willingness to take casualties. Look, in World War II, America took 400,000 casualties. In Vietnam, it took 58,000 casualties. In 25 years of warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq, it took 8,492. And one of the reasons Trump is reluctant to put boots on the ground is domestic public opinion will not allow mass killing of Americans anywhere. So this has been largely an air campaign. Now, there may be some other little small operations done trying to seize an island or two from the Iranians, but the point is a large-scale war becomes increasingly difficult. And look, the one thing we haven't talked, we just talked about it with Sandeep on demographics in Northeast Asia. But if you look at demographics in Europe and America, populations are becoming older. Older populations cannot fight, despite Ukraine. So I think the real problem for unipolarity is unipolarity will implode rather than be challenged by the Chinese.
US as a power is not going away for anywhere for the next 100 years. So are we sort of expecting a G2 kind of arrangement in the coming, no more formalized G2 arrangement with spheres of influence?
It may not be a formalized G2, but like I said, two precedents from Trump. At some stage, the millennials have to become presidential candidates. Though honestly, that one really worries me for so many reasons. But when the millennials come, they come into an America which is vastly different from what their grandparents were in. Again, when I talk about unipolarity imploding, one of the big problems for the US is Social Security, which is the government pension that is given to elderly Americans, may become not insolvent, but unable to pay the full amount by somewhere between 2032 and 2035, which is not that far away, less than a decade away. What they're saying is if, let's say I was to get $100 a month, Social Security could only pay me $70. So the point which sort of comes to what you're saying is America is going to have to make hard choices. And in part, Trump's idea of hemispheric defense is really good because it goes back to Otto Bismarck's description of America's strategic dilemma. He said, America is a lucky country. It's surrounded on two sides by weak neighbors and on two sides by fish. So if that is your security dilemma, it's very easy to handle. And focusing on that, perhaps using your force only in very specific conditions, that can be the model for America. But in the G2, I think this is to answer your question more fully. In the G2, here's what's going to happen. Two presidents from now, you're going to start seeing Americans say, okay, what can be done in G2? And I'll give you some very simple things. There's been talk about this for some time, that you make the head of the IMF a Chinese they make the head of the World Bank an Indian. And for all intent and purposes, the World Bank is headed by an Indian. I'm not sure what his citizenship status is, but why is it that it still is a European who has to head the World Bank, when China is obviously a far more relevant economy to the world? That is the kind of G2 solution which I would do first off. Let's start giving the Chinese a greater role in institutions. Because if they have a greater role in institutions, they're also stakeholders. So that would be the view from the American side. The other thing is, America is going to have to reduce its military footprint. And it's going to have to be, out of the three strategic challenges, which one are you going to focus on? And I suspect for a long time to come, it's very hard to wean the political brokers in Washington away from the Middle East. So you give the Chinese greater play in Asia, but then that makes everybody in Asia nervous. And if you like, we can talk about that.
But the only thing is, will the United States, bet on Middle East now, especially because there's a growing political discontent against intervening in the Middle East, and which is likely to cause political turmoil within United States, no, which is causing to some extent, I would say, of the kind of interventions they've done in the Middle East since the 1990s, and have spent huge amount of money without really gaining much strategic gains.
Yeah, I would have thought that what you're saying would resonate, but look at it this way. The way pro-Palestinian demonstrations were clamped down in universities, the way, despite 60% of Americans being opposed to the war, I'm paying $1 more in gas, in petrol than I was 3 months ago. Americans are not going and putting pressure on their politicians to change course yet. And what I think, let me put it this way, if Trump doesn't put boots on the ground in Iran, he can continue this because his base will not worry. Look, his base voted for him because he said no foreign wars. And his base said we were the cannon fodder for Barack Obama and George Bush. So if he can stay out of boots on the ground, they can continue doing all, and by they I mean the administration can continue policies in the Middle East which are quite militaristic. Again, Atul, remember one thing: the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, all these other people are family owned businesses. They're not nation states. I mean, what is an Emirati? It's an artificial construct. It's a country that came about in 1971. I was born before the, what do you call it? Before the country called the United Arab Emirates came about. Saudi Arabia is a country named after a family. It's like calling America the United States of Trump. So it's ridiculous. So these people, again, have nowhere to go. The Russians aren't going to go in. The Chinese are not that stupid that they're going to get entangled in the Middle East and it's 800 in different combinations and permutations. That leaves the US. And look at the UAE. The UAE's come straight into the American camp, walked out of OPEC. Probably in the next year or so, you're going to see another massive tranche of weapons being bought by the UAE. I don't think the Saudis are going anywhere. So why would the US leave? And the last part in this is, it's important because until the US moves away from petroleum to renewable energy, the Middle East matters. And the US could have moved away because that's what Obama was planning. It didn't happen. Long story on that.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Any other questions? ICS? Snigdha?
I think either I'm very good, I really bored
No,
everybody.
you're brilliant because it's just
Sir, seeing that there are no questions in the chat box, I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
first.
If there are any questions, participants, if you have any remarks, sir, you may
No,
make
thank you
them.
so much, Professor Amit, and it's been a treat listening to you and discussing some of the things and clearing cobwebs in my own mind. And thank you for a fascinating talk today. And I'm sure we've all enjoyed it and we've all gained a lot from it. Thank you so much.
Can I just end with saying one thing? I think since talking to an Indian audience, I think there has to be some very serious thinking in India on how to deal with China. And that's not happening. You know? I am actually quite disappointed with the state of the debate at official levels. Let me be very clear about that. Because,
Could kindly elaborate on this, before
oh gosh, do you want me to? All right, yeah, why not? There's look, I gave a talk to something called the Saturday Group at IIC 2 years ago. And I told them, I said, I don't think you can depend on the United States as an ally. And you need to start talking about your options with China. And then, of course, Trump comes along. And of course, in India, you had Havans for Trump should be elected, most wonderful president that India could ever hope for. And then, of course, everything that happened. And unfortunately, I was proven right on what I said. But what I'm trying to say here is this. Look, there is a very interesting quote from Mukul Keshavan, the historian, who wrote this in The Guardian. He said, what is not understood by the Indians is India is not white enough, is not civilizationally connected to the West, it's not rich enough to be part of the greater Western scheme of things. Okay? And to keep desperately trying to do this is not going to get you any mileage in Washington or Brussels. Fact of the matter is, unless you're willing to invest $300-400 billion in the United States, you're not relevant. And this problem will not go away. Second thing is, you're not willing to be the aggressive attack dog in Asia of the Western alliance against China. And I don't think India should, by the way. Okay? And it's really a bad thought. So what role are you going to fulfill in the Western alliance? And add to this, you don't get technology. Yeah. You keep hopping on the GF404 engine. It's still coming. And you're not going to get technologies which give you the ability to compete with the Chinese. Let me give you two examples of why the Chinese are so formidable now. India is struggling with a fourth generation fighter. China has built sixth generation fighters. I'm very proud of my car because I can go 0 to 100 in 4.6 seconds in it. Until the Chinese phone company Xiaomi just built a car which goes 0 to 100 in 1.7 seconds, and they're going to put it on the market. So everybody who's a speed demon like me is going to go out and buy one of those.
One thing I would like to ask, should India be really building a manned aircraft?
Well, no.
Sixth generation.
No. I can answer that too. What they should be doing is building a lot of smart missiles. The Iranians put this way, and Atul, you pointed this out. Iran has done rather well for itself in this war. But the Iranian chief missile designer gave an interview where he said, look, we didn't build aircraft because we always knew we'd be a generation or two generations behind the rest of the world. And because of sanctions and so on, these things would be difficult to build. You have a decent aircraft in the Tejas, you put smart missiles on it. And if you look at what happened in Operation Sindoor, the Indian Air Force didn't cross the line of control. Indian missiles crossed the line of control. So build what you're good at, build what is easy to do. And my first book pointed this out. I said, you can build things which nobody gives you the technology for. So aircraft, ships, tanks, you're always buying from outside because you can do that. But in terms of nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, there were sanctions on you. So you built them. And that is the real Atmanirbhar, not this rubbish about we will build a fighter aircraft. That is not Atmanirbhar. Atmanirbhar was given to you by Raja Ramanna and Anil Kakodkar and Chidambaran, for which they should be considered national heroes. I would name a street after these people in New Delhi, or 3 streets. So you don't need any of this. And the Chinese have done the same thing. They've built missiles. Look at the Iranians. The American ships are sitting over 1,000 miles from Iranian waters, except what they have going in the Strait of Hormuz, which isn't much. It's 12 ships.
Because had Iranians basically relied on legacy platforms, naval platforms, they would have been destroyed in 2 days.
That's exactly what the Iranians said. They said, oh, well, look what happened to Dera. So to come back to the point, though, on China, here's the thing. You are barking after an alliance which is never going to put you on par. And the reason you're barking after it is, as I say, India's elite children must study at Harvard. I mean, let's be honest about this for a change. After all the abuse that has been given to India in the last year and a half, why is it that India reacts the way it reacts? And I'll tell you one thing. My state of Alabama, where I'm sitting today, sent a delegation to India in October saying we would like to get students to come to the University of North Alabama, the University of West Alabama. Nobody in India was interested. Indians were interested in, we want to go to Harvard. Now, Atul, this is what I want your audience to understand.
We're live on live, so it is good that,
Yeah, well, good. And again, a lot of people don't like what I say because it doesn't fit in with the official mythos. Look, the state of Massachusetts, where Harvard is physically located, has a budget of $62 billion. Harvard's endowment is $55 billion. So it's almost as much as the state of Massachusetts. Do you think Harvard gives a damn that India set up some kind of Nehru fellowship or professorship there? It's a small drop in the Harvard ocean. But if you were to send 5,000 students to Alabama, you would have senators from Alabama on your side. You would have congressmen from Alabama on your side. And America is not about buying the elites. America is about having good relations with 50 states. Okay? That's not understood in India. And I've said for years, India should set up like the Confucius centers, but not with the agenda of the Confucius centers. It should set up a Gandhi center in each of the 50 states. And I take Gandhi because that's the only Indian that we can agree on. Right? Yeah, everybody else is controversial. But you set up 50 centers and you say we will do 3 things there. 1, we'll teach yoga, which everybody in America likes. 2, we'll teach Indian cooking, which everybody in America likes. 3rd, go to FTII in Pune. They have the entire archive of Indian movies. And you bring over movies, and not just this, what do you call it? Not just the Bollywood stuff, but Satyajit Ray, Mrinal Sen, Ritvik Ghatak, some of the other people, you would build up a base for India across 50 states. And 50 states means 100 senators and 445 House of Representatives.
Yeah, rather than spending on the PR firms, this.
Rather than spending on the PR firms. Okay. And you then build up a support for the country. You build up a fondness among people for the country. And that is where you develop soft power. not by sitting in Washington, but in Washington, the Chinese can outspend you and the Saudis can outspend you. Prince Bandar sat for what, 20, 30 years as the ambassador and built a huge Saudi alliance there. So you can't do this because you don't think imaginatively on this. On China, what I would say is, I think what India should be doing is what Deng Xiaoping said so long ago, which is hide your capabilities, build your capabilities, bide your time. And 10, 20 years from now, maybe then discuss the border. But till then, build India to an advanced sixth generation level of AI, technology, military technology, so on. And it can be done. As I said, if people like Raja Ramanna, Kakodkar, and Chidambaran could build nuclear weapons for you, I'm sure people in India can build AI for you.
Definitely.
So don't antagonize the Chinese, but also tell them the border is still an issue. We haven't forgotten that. See how much trade you can do because, Sandeep will tell you, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Chinese have pretty racist ideas towards each other, hate each other. But at the end of the day, they trade a lot. And there is nothing wrong with making money off your enemy. So that I'll end with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll close the session, and ICS, you can give the vote of thanks, please.
Yeah. So with this, we come to the end of today's special lecture. We thank Dr. Amit Gupta for a rich and insightful lecture. Truly, a great take, sir. And Dr. Atul Bharadwaj for chairing this session. We also thank the audience for joining us this evening. The video of today's lecture will be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to our upcoming seminar scheduled for the 20th of May titled The Manus Fallout and Beyond, Decoding China's Evolving Approach Towards Governing Technology Enterprises. Further information about the event may be found out on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you everybody for joining us today.